Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today, we take a look at the final turn of our cycle, looking at art in the early modern period. We're going to be looking mostly at a little bit in Mannerism, and then focusing a lot on Baroque near the second part of this episode. This is one of my favorite times. We're actually going to look at one of my personal favorite artists, so it's going to be a really fun time. Hope that you enjoy this as much as I do. So, without further ado, we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off with the last episode. We had just talked about the Protestant Reformation and the upheavals that were spreading throughout the continent of Europe, mostly in the north and the northwest. The Reformation was more than just a new religion or a new take on old ways and old customs. There had become a split difference in the way that some of the lay people, those not a part of the Catholic Church, and the lay people, the priests and those kinds up to the Pope, saw themselves and their religion and the way that they wanted to live their lives. So, the Reformation was really a revolt against what they perceived as abuses of power. The church was originally supposed to be more of a moral authority, and it did a very good job in preserving old structures and old ways. The archdioceses that were spread throughout Europe were basically the exact same administrative regions as the old Roman provinces, and it really helped to give a sense of coherence while the decentralization and near anarchy of the feudal era drove on and brought down just about everything in its way. With the resurgence of old ideas and the Renaissance that spread throughout Europe, bringing back culture and learning, and even new concepts like the printing press and more freely available books and literature, the Reformation really began to take hold and began to change the way that the everyday person in Europe saw their life and saw their place in society. This is certainly important to talk about Martin Luther a little bit. He's known for taking his 95 Theses, which was protests against the way that the church ran at his time, nailing them to a door at a local church. Whether or not he actually nailed them in this manner, or more likely gave this as a speech to some important people, isn't really as important as the fact that he had stood up for himself and for his people, and the Pope responded in kind with excommunication. This was very popular at the time, and this was one of the main abuses of power which the Reformists were attempting to get rid of. An excommunication is when the church decides that your soul is no longer saved and you are basically damned to hell. This was counter to the way that the Protestants and the Reformists wanted to look at religion. They saw it more as a personal thing. Less that the Pope had the ability to grant salvation, and more that the religion, spirituality, and the application of the values of Christ were what granted salvation. This and a few other very important differences led to what would become larger and larger splits, and these splits were actually embraced by a lot of the leaders in Northern Europe. The humanism movement in art and in thinking brought the average person to the forefront in a way that they never really had been before. And this was another large reason why the old Catholic Church and the old Catholic ways were beginning to fail. They no longer addressed the average person. You see, a rich noble or king, someone with power and status, could live a very bad and very intolerable, very immoral life, purchase indulgences, sacraments, and favors from the church, and continue being a bad person, knowing that, according to their pope, their soul was saved. If you were poor and a good person, you were actually seen as only being halfway there. So it became more of a right of money than a right of acts or a right of faith. The faith element was what was really focused on, and becoming like Christ, Christian, was the center of this reformist Protestant movement. The humanist art was another way that the artists and the thinkers could rebel against the old structures by refusing to focus on the rich and the powerful, and instead focusing on the everyday and the average. They were going against a long history in artistic tradition that said that those who were influential were the only ones that really mattered. There was a relatively good period in the early Protestant movement, just like in the early Christian movement, with the Desert Fathers and people like this, before it really got absorbed into the Roman state. It was a much better idea, but there was some important aspects of Protestantism and Reformism which could be actually taken by the powerful, who these people were revolting against, and used as a tool. Specifically, if you were a foreign king far from Rome, you had to sort of bend your knee to the Pope for a number of different reasons, excommunication being one of them. But now, instead of doing that, you could form a new state church. The King of England, King Henry VIII, he was not so much into Reformism and Protestantism for the lessons and the morality. He was a very immoral kind of guy, to be perfectly honest. He was more into it because it was a consolidation of power. He could pick his own bishops, he could pick his own church, and he could have them underneath his authority. This was leaning back a little bit against the old ways of a separation of the church and the state, which had never been as strong as it would come to become in the future. But it showed the further abuses that could be taken by a lord who embraced these values specifically for monetary and personal gain. This would fuel further separation, even in the Protestant and Reformations themselves, which would lead to specific sects and areas of Christianity, such as the Puritans, wanting to get further and further away from what they had originally been a huge part of. Through the dissolution of monasteries, which we'll take a little bit closer look at in a minute, and the abolition of the payments to the church, the tithes and things like this, the lords, nobles, and kings could enrich themselves through these Protestant movements, making the conversion of a local state, such as England, Sweden, various nations in the Holy Roman Empire, much more appealing to the ruling class than staying part of the old Catholic way. There had always been various groups of Christians within Christendom that didn't subscribe to the exact teachings of the Catholic Church. We talked about the various holy sees in the other parts of the empire, but in the traditional Catholic lands, they had usually been quelled with relative ease, put down, persecuted, and marginalized without much ado. This would become very different with Lutheranism in the north and with the English Reformation. When the King of England and when a emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and later Sweden and a few other nations all embraced the Protestant movement for themselves, they began to become more entrenched in the philosophies and the ideas of the Protestant movement, and they began to enrich themselves and to see no reason to go back and to reconvert. I mentioned the dissolution of the monasteries. This happened on both ends, in the New Catholic Order and in the New Protestant and Reformation orders. Previously, up to the High Middle Ages, not so much in the Late Middle Ages, you could get rid of your wealth and your nice objects by donating them to a monastery. Monasteries also didn't have children since they were specifically for single men. So when they died, all of their goods and all of the wealth that they had accumulated stayed within the monastery. These became centers that would attract lots of raiders, especially Vikings and things like that, but they actually did a really good job of maintaining that wealth and that material culture up until the time of the Reformation and what would become the Counter-Reformation. So, with the entrenchment of Protestantism, the Catholics decided that they needed to do something to address their grievances and the perceived wrongs of the Catholic Church, and they did just that. They enacted what was called the Counter-Reformation, beginning with the Council of Trent, and the basic idea was to redirect the way that the Church had worked for the past few centuries. Now, the Pope had not always been as powerful of a figure as he was in the High and Late Middle Ages. He had spent centuries from about 1000 AD to about the 15th century consolidating power through various papal bulls and other ordinances which limited the rights of the lower ranking laity, which banished priests from marrying, which brought in lots of new revenue. So before the Reformation, you could buy sacraments, you could buy icons, you could buy indulgences to absolve you of your sins. Pilgrimages were encouraged, which meant that you would go to a famous Catholic site. When you went there, you would pay a tithe, you would purchase something from them. All of this money was funneled to the papal coffers to enrich the life of whichever pope was currently serving. The popes at the time became very creative with their means of extracting wealth from the various corners of Christendom. And as they added on all these new layers of ways to take money through, like I've said, tithes, sacraments, icons, pilgrimages, indulgences, and several other things that were purchased and were not earned by any specific morality or ethical prowess, the Pope became very rich and very powerful. This was seen as sort of counter to the whole idea of the Christian faith to begin with, which at this time was also being deeply reconciled with old philosophical and ethical means from the likes of people like Montaigne in France, who was really into Plutarch and Cicero and a lot of these old thinkers who themselves were not Christians, but who still gave very profound and very exciting ideas which could be applied to someone's life to better their situation regardless of their stature in their society. The Counter-Reformation, which was the response to the Protestant movement, focused on a lot of the areas, not all of them, but a lot of the areas where the traditional Catholic Church had failed. Previously, in the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon for the low levels of the laity, such as the priests that had the small churches out in the country and places like that, to not actually be able to read. They were very dependent on the higher levels of the church structure to give them insight into the teachings and the Bible, and then they would take these stories and go and tell them, not ever actually knowing how to understand the topic itself. This became even worse as bishops and archbishops, who were known as the princes of the church, they had the same sway in society as princes of small land holdings in other areas of Europe, began to disappear from the areas where they were supposed to be, where they held land, where they were responsible for the education and the moral well-being of their citizens, and accumulated in Rome, where they had power and influence. This trade of protecting and enriching the lives of those whom they were supposed to be dedicated to for political significance was a huge problem for the church itself, because as the lower levels of the church became more and more separated from the higher levels, the teachings that they could give and the practical application to the average person shrank dramatically. These so-called political bishops and also absentee bishops were done away with, and new focus on excellent administration and teaching for everyone in the laity was a main focus of the Reformation. A large part was also the patronage of new and beautiful art, which we'll get a little bit more into in the second part. But the Counter-Reformation was really the Catholic Church's admittance that popes such as Alexander VI in the late 15th century were enriching themselves at the expense of the average person, and this kind of process could not continue forever before something like Protestantism would dethrone the power of the Pope for good. So, now that we have the framing for how and why these artistic movements were flourishing and developing, we can take a little bit closer look at the actual art forms. Before we can really get into Baroque art, we need to understand how they got from the Renaissance style to the Baroque style. And there's actually a very interesting movement which lasted in Italy for about 80 years called Mannerism. Mannerism served as a link between these two art periods. It was actually very interesting for its composition and the reason why it existed in the first place. With the Renaissance, the striving for infinity, which Western art had been attempting for centuries, millennia even, had come to a close. For just about the entire history of art in the West, the object was realism, what we would today call something like photorealism, meaning looking like a photograph, although obviously they didn't have the same conception because they didn't have photographs. But with the advent of the Renaissance and famous artists such as Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, and people like this, the objective of painting a realistic and emotive painting came within grasp of just about anyone who was a professional artist. It wasn't so impressive any longer to paint a realistic looking painting. In fact, just about any professional could do so. So what happens when the goal, which your culture has been striving for a couple thousand years, is finally attained? It's a very hard question to grapple with, and the artists of the time didn't want to just do paintings that looked like everything else, because that wouldn't really stand out. So the new Mannerist school was the answer to what happens when you've already achieved perfection. You push through, you stretch everything as far as it'll go, and you attempt to make something better than perfect. The Mannerist school and the Mannerist pieces can look very strange. There's lots of elongation, there's lots of bizarre perspectives, and most of the stances and the poses that the subjects take in these paintings don't look natural. At first glance, it can almost seem like a step back from the Renaissance until you realize what it is that these artists were actually trying to accomplish. The difficult parts in art previously, perspective, the subject matter, the distance from the background, the realism, was taken and stretched to its limits. Elongated limbs and different ways that were more focused on difficulty and technical prowess were the focus of the Mannerist school. They didn't care so much about showing a real person in a real setting. What they really cared about was doing the most difficult and the most technically bizarre and reaching elements in their paintings. So before, realism had been this sort of goal, but with that goal reached, they had to go somewhere in order to continue to stand out and to refine their art. With some other areas and some other techniques of artwork, various cultures would get to a certain point and would cut it off. That was what they had been trying to go for, and that was going to be good enough. The various Italian artists, though, didn't see things this way, and they wanted to be unique and special and the best, to put it into as few words as possible. Thus, Mannerism, fusion of complexity of the style of Michelangelo and the style of beauty of Raphael, were attempted to intermingle and mix to produce new, complex, and technically difficult art. This is a very interesting style of art. It is certainly not one of my favorites. I don't believe it's a lot of people's favorites, but you really have to be able to understand and to appreciate the fact that they had nowhere to go, obviously, so they had to push it somewhere. The focus on the technical aspects would come to a head with the next style in Baroque art. But for a while, Mannerism was considered the pinnacle to push past the old perfection of the Renaissance styles of art. If you have any comments or suggestions, I also have a comment section on the channel. You can go ahead and go there as well. But until next time, Ave Imperator.